Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Talk to Susan. Today, we have a special guest by the name of Reid Vanderburgh, and our show focuses on people who are making a difference in society. And Reid has not been receiving enough recognition, so we are inviting Reid to our show. Hello, Reid. How's it going?
Good morning, Susan. It's going
Good
quite well
morning.
here. Blue skies, which is pretty rare in Portland, Oregon at this time of year.
Wow, sounds good for winter. I'm used to thinking of snow in Oregon. So, what are you up to, Reid?
Well, today I'm just up to talking with you because I really enjoy talking about various kinds of issues with people.
Yeah.
I want to start a podcast because I've done a lot of different venues in the past. I've written a couple of books. I do a lot of trainings and talking with different groups and whatnot. But I want to spread the word a little wider because there's been so much misperception about trans identity. And
Yes.
I transitioned myself back in the mid 1990s. And at that time, this identity was not on the radar at all. For better or worse, it meant that there was less support. It was harder to find other people to talk to, other trans people. But on the other hand, I didn't have to worry about my identity being targeted in the media. So things have changed considerably, and in some ways it's easier to transition, easier to find support, but in other ways it's also easy to be very discouraged because of the way that trans identity is portrayed all too often in conservative media in particular.
Right. And it's so tough, I believe just the quote coming out is just so scary for a lot of people, right? And how did that quote even come about? How did that phrase come about?
Well, it dates back, my understanding, because I transitioned out of lesbian community. So I was part of that community from the early 1970s until the mid 90s. And my recollection of the term coming out is that it actually dated back to the 40s and 50s, mostly around gay men, but probably also around lesbians as well, that you would have a lover that you might sneak over to your house when your spouse, your actual legal spouse, wasn't home. Nobody lived this identity openly. Not back then. It was too dangerous. There were no legal protections. You could get thrown into a mental institution and committed against your will if someone found out you were, quote, homosexual, which was the terminology of the day. So if you had a lover over and your actual spouse came home unexpectedly, your lover would hide in the closet.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
That's the origin of the term coming out of the closet. That's what it means.
I had no idea. That's very fascinating, though.
Well, it helps to be 67. I have some of this generational experience, I guess you'd call it, and stories from times that were past when I came out as a lesbian at 19, but the people that lived those experiences were still alive to tell the story.
What's funny is that well, not really funny. Maybe it is. I don't know. Entertaining, perhaps. Is that I grew up with watching Chinese movies about the royal families of various decades. And oftentimes there were, the movies were about homosexual, like lesbian, gay kind of relationships. And often some of the royalty was that, So I thought, oh, that's pretty normal, right? So, I mean, not being born in the United States, I have a very different perception of gay lesbian relationships. So even when I guess after I grew up in the United States, and some of the Asians that I've known, like Filipinos, it's typical for them to hold hands with each other. Like the women walking down the street, they'll hold hands with each other. And I thought, wow, that's weird. Nobody's ever done that with me, And I thought that was just a source of endearment, because that's just cultural. So, yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, and it brings up an interesting point about transition, because when you transition, it's not something that people think about a lot if they've never had to go through this process. And folks in that position who are comfortable with their birth gender assignment, that's called being cisgender. So people who are cisgender, you don't know what you know until you try to change gender roles, because now you're trying to actualize an identity that people learn on the playground when they're 3 years old and start interacting with other boys or other girls.
Yep.
And I use that terminology because when I was a kid, that was all that was available, was boy and girl.
I
But you
know.
don't know what you know until you try to live a different gender role invisibly.
Yep.
And it's very much like going to a foreign country where
Hmm.
no one knows, everyone sees you as a native. No one knows you came from somewhere else. So they expect you to behave in a certain way, and
Yep.
you don't get little things quite right. And people look at you oddly like, that was a little off.
Like, whoa,
Yeah,
what
and
happened?
it's hard to even think of an example because it's little things. It's not the big things. It's little
Uh-huh.
things.
Yep.
How close
I
do you
get it.
stand to each other? What topics of conversation? So if you transition to female, for example, and you were raised as a guy,
Yep.
the first time you walk into an all-female group and everyone sees you as a woman,
Mm,
you don't really know the rules of engagement. Because if you're
that's
still
true.
a man, if there's a group of women sitting around doing various things and a guy comes in and joins their circle, it
Mm,
changes the dynamic very subtly. All the little rules of engagement are just a bit different. The topics of conversation, it's just slightly different.
right.
But
That's
if you're
good.
perceived as a woman, you're expected to know all that. And then if you don't, so it scares people in early in transition, especially things like going in the bathroom
Right.
or other bathroom. What am I supposed to do in here? Am I going to get kicked out? Am I going to get in trouble? That
Mm.
sort of that sort of thing arises. I
That's so
actually have a
funny.
story to tell about that I heard from some friends of mine. They
Uh-huh.
are both older trans women. They're in their late 60s. They transitioned late in life, so they lived as men most of their lives, and they transitioned during quarantine.
Oh, wow.
So for a couple of years, they never left the house. They didn't see anybody else, and it gave them some period of time to relax
Of
into
course.
how do I dress as a woman? What does makeup even look like? How do I do
Mhm.
this? The first time they ventured out in public, they went to a movie together,
Mm.
and they went in, and there's hardly anybody there. So one of them thought, okay, I'm gonna get up my nerve, and I'm going to use the women's bathroom for the first time. She'd
Wow.
never done that before. So she went in the bathroom. Nobody was there. She was so relieved. She went in the stall, and she's sitting there, and she heard the door open and someone came in, and she thought, oh my God, I'm going to get in such trouble here,
Oh,
because she had that taboo ingrained in her
yeah.
from childhood. Boys don't go in the girls' bathroom. It was
I
so
know.
deeply ingrained. It was really hard for her to be in there at all. So
Mm-hmm.
she went out of the stall when she was done, and she told me later, she ran out of the bathroom. She didn't even look at the other woman. She ducked her head like this so she
Oh my
wouldn't be
gosh.
seen. She just ran out of the bathroom and back to her seat, and her heart was pounding. And she
Ooh,
sat there and collected herself. And the friend she came to the movie with, she wasn't there.
yep.
So she got to
Uh-oh.
sit there. She got to sit there and just say, "Okay, I survived." And then her friend came back. Her friend came back and said, how come you ran out of the bathroom like that? I wanted to ask if you wanted popcorn.
How
It
funny.
was the other trans woman. She was so scared being in that bathroom. She didn't even notice it was her friend who had come in.
Yeah, that's terrible. I know. I can understand how that could be intimidating, you know, because I came to the United States at a very young age, so English was my second language. So I didn't really know the rules of the land. I mean, it was like, oh, there's a bathroom. I could go wherever I want, you know, just go in whichever. And I would change my name every day. It's so strange. I At the time I was watching cartoons like from Charlie Brown, you know, the Snoopy. So one day I was Lucy, the next day I was Snoopy, then the next day I was Charlie, and the teacher was like, "Who is this?" So I just thought, oh, I don't know my name yet, you know, because
Mhm.
it's my Chinese name and most people couldn't pronounce it. So then I had a very good friend. Her name was Suzanne, and then I didn't really want to be like Suzanne, so I said I'll change my name to Susan, you know, something like yours. I'll do my
Yeah,
name as Susan, so I became Susan.
yeah, yeah. And finding your name, I mean,
Yep.
it really rings a bell with me about what it's like to find your name. The name I was given at birth was Nancy.
Oh, okay.
Well, in 1995, I finally realized I was trans. I was almost 40 years old,
Oh, wow.
and I didn't quite know how to tell my family. So I kind of tested the waters with my sister, whose name was Susan, by the way. And I tested the waters with her. And I said, I'd already found the name Reid. And I'll
Uh-huh.
talk about that in a second. But I didn't tell Susan I'd already chosen a name. I wanted to see what would her reaction be if I was going to change my name at all without even telling her
Yep.
why. So I said to her, I'm thinking of changing my name. I just don't think Nancy fits me very well. And I'll never forget this. It was so supportive without her even knowing she was supporting me. She
Right.
said, "Your name hasn't fit you since you were 5."
Oh, how funny.
And that was so
Yeah.
empowering. I thought, okay, recognition from my sister, who was one of my people raising me. She was much older than I am,
Mm-hmm.
and she's 12 years older than me. So she was one of my babysitters when I was a little kid. She was in a very good position to know that.
Yeah.
And it had a lot of meaning to me. So choosing a new name, it's so powerful. And that's one reason why it's so upsetting to trans people when people they're really close to and really care about slip on their name, especially if they don't seem to be trying to make the change. It's different if somebody's just got a bad memory, they are really set in their ways, they kind of go on autopilot a lot in the world, moving through the world. It's different if someone in that position forgets your name because they have a harder time adjusting. But if it seems to be deliberate, it's really difficult to cope with that, especially if the person in question is someone that you feel very close to. Family members fall in that category. My sister certainly would have fallen in that category.
You know,
But
that's
fortunately for me, my family was very accepting. They made a great deal of effort to change names and pronouns for me. It's really hard. It's different if somebody in your family comes out as lesbian or gay. It's
yep.
an adjustment. Yes, it's an adjustment, but it's different if you're changing your name and your pronoun. I went from being the youngest sister to being the youngest brother in my family, the youngest son. That's a hard adjustment for family members to make.
I guess. I can see how, someone could really and easily slip and say she instead of he.
Absolutely.
You
And it was, I have some personal experience with both sides of this
know?
coin because I came out as a lesbian in 1974.
Yeah.
And I told my mother first, and then I told my sister Susan. I mean, I let everyone else in the family just kind of figure it out. I would wear buttons on my backpack that said things like gay and proud. And so over time, they all figured it out. No one ever talked about it. That's don't ask, don't tell didn't originate with Bill Clinton.
Yes,
That's
I
been the
know.
way that people handled coming out to their families for many, many years. They just let
Yep.
people figure it out gradually. And if they had a problem with it, maybe they would bring it up and you just wouldn't hang out with that family member. But it's really different if you transition because you have to be proactive and tell people your new name and your new pronoun if you expect them to respect your identity.
Yeah. It's like a
But,
commitment, right?
but then you do have to give them time to adjust, and especially with family because they've known you your whole life or their whole life, one of the two.
Yes,
And so it's a big deal.
it is. It's funny too. It's so coincidental. For people who are tuning in and don't know, we are related.
We are. That last
I'm
name is not
married. I'm
coincidental.
I'm married into the family, so I got my name Vanderburgh, and my maiden name was not really my name anyway. So I really for a very long time I was just so lost. I couldn't use my real name, couldn't use my real Chinese name, my
Mhm.
real Chinese surname because I always went by another name. So I went to school under that name and I was like, I don't know. It's easy to spell, but it's not really me. It's not even my culture,
Yeah,
you know? So even at school, people know me as Susan Tran, but then it's like, I think there's another person out there by that name, but that's not me. But
mhm.
it is me. It's just not me. It's sort of that like inner turmoil kind of feeling.
Yeah,
And then even when I was on the playground, I was being surrounded by a lot of girls. This was when I was in kindergarten, and I felt really uncomfortable. And I thought, well, don't girls only like boys? And I was being surrounded by all these girls. I thought maybe they think I'm a boy. Kids can
yeah,
get really confused. I was very confused. I was
uh-huh.
like, I don't know. Maybe I'll act like a boy tomorrow and I'll go play with the boys. And the boys were looking at me, what are you doing? And I was sort of a tomboy. I didn't even really know the term at the time. So I would go, even in high school, I was playing basketball and the girls were like, I don't want to play anymore. My nails are chipped. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is PE class. We're doing basketball. You're supposed to be proactive with the ball. Oh no, I'm too tired. And then I thought, okay, I'll just go play with the boys.
Yeah,
Didn't really think much about it. And it's so strange too. People also called me Nancy. Isn't
They
that
did.
coincidental? Yeah. I was like, how do I look like a Nancy?
No.
My name to Susan a long time ago, but I don't know how and why people are saying I'm a
Yeah,
Nancy. So even in
that
class,
is so strange.
I know during roll call, the teacher would say Nancy, and I'm looking around. You mean Susan?
Wow.
I
Well,
just don't know how that name came about. So it's meant to be that you and I were meant to meet.
apparently so.
And, and I met your sister, and we're like, oh, her ex-spouse said to me, I've never known Susan Vanderburgh to look like this. Like me.
Well, that's a good point. You don't look
Yeah,
like
I'm the
your
other
sister.
Susan.
That's very true.
I said, yeah, I'm the other Susan Vanderburgh. And we have different middle initials. So your sister, Susan, said, yeah, I'm SSW or SS. They used to call her SSW, but it's SSV. I said, yeah, I'm SPV. So I'm the other Susan. We bonded that way. She was a very nice lady. And I mean, it was just the whole family is so interesting to me.
Families are interesting. That is,
Yes.
yeah, that is very true.
Mhm. So you became a therapist because was it a result of your journey or transition?
It definitely was.
Mhm.
I had never been in therapy before, and I had a partner. This was 1995. I had a partner who came out, and bear in mind, I had no idea I was trans.
Oh.
I heard two different stories from my clients, and one of them matched mine. But at the
Oh.
time, I didn't know that this was common to feel different and to
Mhm.
not really fit in and to not understand why. And when I realized I was attracted to women back in 1974 at 19, I thought, oh, I'm a lesbian. That explains why I always felt different as a child.
Yeah.
But I never looked for another explanation because it didn't occur to me that there might be one.
Right.
But I continue to be feeling like not fitting in. And here I am part of lesbian community, which is a very closed community. You're either in that circle or you're not. And I was very much in the circle, and I still didn't feel a sense of belonging or fitting in. I tried really hard.
Yes.
But in 1995, I had a partner who came out to me one night and said, I've always felt like a man inside, and if I had the money, I'd have an operation tomorrow. And I'll tell you, denial is an incredibly interesting defense mechanism. I think we are the only species capable of lying to ourselves.
Hmm.
And it's a talent that we call denial, and it gets us through a lot of crap in childhood. That's why we do it. We have something we can't face, don't want to face, or too afraid to face. It's too scary, and we park it over in a corner and we hide it from ourselves. And that's what I did with that gender identity for all those years because it never occurred to me there was another explanation. And that's why it didn't occur to me.
Right.
So when my partner came out to me, denial will only take you so far. It didn't survive that level of in your face exposure to an identity that actually did fit me. But it
Right.
sent me into a tailspin. And I had a breakdown over that. And I got into therapy for the first time in my life. And that's when I realized, well, that's not when I realized, that's when I experienced the fact that most therapists at that time saw this as a mental illness. It was in the
Mhm.
DSM, the
Yep.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual used to diagnose various mental illnesses. And the therapists were treating it like that. They were asking me questions based on diagnosis, not
Mhm.
based on identity emergence.
Right. And it's so new back then.
What was that?
It was so new back then. They just didn't know what
Oh,
to
it
do.
wasn't really new.
No.
The idea of identity emergence, that
Mm.
was new. And that's the face that I brought to it when I became a therapist. But I had really negative experiences with therapists that really set me back in my own process of figuring out who
Mhm.
I was.
Yeah. It's
One
terrible.
therapist, for example, asked me, how long have you felt like this? And
Mhm.
I said, consciously? How long have I known consciously? About 4 days. And because I
Okay.
couldn't say I'd had lifelong conscious knowledge of these
Mhm.
feelings, she discounted my conclusion because that's not what the DSM said.
Oh.
The DSM said you had to have known your whole life. It had to have been conscious. It had to have brought you extreme anxiety, extreme depression, which it
Mhm.
did, but I wasn't conscious of why I
Right.
was depressed and anxious. I just knew I felt those feelings, but I didn't know to connect it to my gender identity. There were no role models culturally, nothing to reflect my identity back to me.
Right.
not at that time. So I eventually I thought, I can do better than this. And so
Mhm.
I went back to school and became a therapist. And my focus was identity emergence because I realized that's exactly what I'd experienced.
Yep.
And as the years went by, and I worked with about 500 people who were all of them questioning their birth gender assignment. They came to slightly different answers about what that meant, what the
Mhm.
process would be like for them. But that's the one thing they all had in common. They did not resonate with the gender assigned them at birth. And if you think about it, that is very little to have in common when you're
Yes.
talking about trans and non binary people. They didn't have anything else in common. The
Mhm.
gender they were assigned, their age, their race, their religion, none of it. So I
Yep.
heard a lot of very different stories from people. But my story of not knowing what it was, feeling different, not fitting in, I heard that from about half my clients. And the other half would say things like, I knew from before I could talk.
Wow.
One client, that didn't mean they did anything about it. One client
Mhm.
was 53 when she made her first appointment with me. This would have been sometime like 2004, 2005.
Mhm.
And she sat down and she said, I felt like a girl since before I could talk. And I said, okay. And then
Mhm.
she said, that's the first time I've ever said that out loud. So this is someone who had tried really, really hard to live up to family expectations of being a boy and had really, that's another story I heard quite often from older trans women, the ones transitioning away from that male gender role. They tried so hard because they saw it as their role in life to support a family. So they would do things like at a young age, they would join the military, they would get
Mhm.
married young, they would have kids, they would get into a male dominated profession. They were doing everything they could to shore up their identity as men. And they had one of two thoughts in the back of their mind. One was, if I do all this, no one will ever suspect how I really feel inside. But the other thought was, maybe one of these things that I try will actually work to make me feel okay being a man.
Right.
And they were generally really confused, especially if they married a woman that they recognized as their soulmate.
Oh,
They
wow.
were like, okay, I've met the love of my life. I'm still not okay.
Yep.
Sometimes they would be for a while,
Mhm.
but then the feelings would gradually return and they would be even more in despair because they would think, well, on paper, it looks like I have everything,
Yes.
but I don't feel like I have anything. And I heard that story many times also from older
Mhm.
trans women that they and then when they finally decided I can't take it anymore, I have to transition,
Yep.
the people in their lives generally didn't believe them. They had
Yes.
done such a good job living this male role, and there was so little understanding of what it actually looked like to be trans. People assumed it looked like a man in a dress, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
people would be very disbelieving. Oh,
Mhm.
that can't be it. No, no, that's not it.
Mm. That's like a really serious discussion, you know?
Yeah.
And I can only imagine like the inner turmoil, you know. I can relate to this as an immigrant and how things don't look the way I think they should be. But
Mhm.
it's just, me. And I've always been called weird because I never really resonated with people I went to school with, Like I always thought in Chinese. You know what I mean? Because my background is Chinese, so I always thought, okay, it's normal to respect your elders. Don't talk back. When someone's saying something, just stay there and listen, and then if they ask you, then offer an opinion. And I was, somebody, well, I guess through school, people were saying, oh, you're just a shy Chinese girl, essentially saying they don't expect more from me. Just hide in the corner somewhere, kind of thing. And I
Mhm.
thought, I don't think I'm shy.
I don't think you're shy.
I don't know. I thought I was like, is shy a good thing? I just didn't know. So I thought, I'll prove you what shy is not. So then I just did whatever I thought I needed to do. Take a lot of public speaking, well, not really a lot of public speaking, but just try my hand at being on the stage. And and I thought, well, I don't think I fit that definition of shy, you know. So sometimes it also takes a lot of courage to go against what society thinks of you, right?
Mhm.
Like the roles that they think that we should be living in or acting in. And I really like Shakespeare because his quote was one of his quotes, all of the world is a stage and all of us or the men are actors. And I thought, wow, that's really profound because we are all just actors on a stage and we are often on center stage. Regardless of what we're doing, each person is on his or her own center stage. So I thought, well, I'm just going to make my life whatever I feel it should be, you know. As you know, I married into the family, and I never really looked back and said, well, I'm supposed to be staying at home and cooking for the kids. You know, I can't. I just don't cook. I mean, I'm prohibited from being in the kitchen. And it's gotten so bad when Eric was sick, my husband, when he was so ill, he couldn't get out of bed to cook. I made dinner for everybody and I served it to our one dog at the time. And she just looked up at me like, I couldn't imagine that look would come from her. she, she looked at me that way and then she walked away. And I thought, oh, great. I hope it was, I did okay with that food. It was steak. I couldn't have messed it up that bad. So he was ill recently too, and then I did some cooking for the whole family, and I'm like, I don't know, this doesn't smell that good. And we have 5 dogs now, so each one of them, Eric took the food to each of them, and they just sort of ran away. So he said, "Okay, you're not allowed in the kitchen anymore." So I'm not supposed to be cooking.
Well, you do make really good points that a lot of what we think of as normal and reality, it's all a role. It's what we've been taught is reality.
Exactly.
One thing that resonated with me, this was back when I was still in graduate school, so this was 23, 24 years ago.
Wow.
In my internship site, a client told me a story. He was raised as a girl, and he was of Cherokee descent. And he had the thought to wonder, well, what did ancient Cherokee culture have to say about trans identity? He was really curious. How would they have handled me back then? And he did some research, and what he found was really interesting. He found that in ancient Cherokee culture, babies were not assigned a gender at birth because the tribe understood, we don't know who you are.
Yeah.
So how can we make the assumption that we know your gender? That's silly. I don't think they quite put it that way, but the result was, and I'm extrapolating here because I think this is probably how they would have handled it. It's logical that babies probably all had a placeholder pronoun, kind of like they, them. We don't know your gender, therefore we're going to call all of you by the same pronoun. And then what they would do at specific ages, they would present the child with different toys and games and implements, and by the child's behavior, what they gravitate toward, they understood who the child was.
Yep.
And then at some point they would be given a pronoun, a gender, and they would be given a name, because by then the tribe would know much better who they were. And the children that gravitated in directions that were what you might call non-standard, like the ones who you might think would gravitate toward the boy end of the spectrum, but instead went toward the girl end of the spectrum, those children, the tribe thought, okay, there's something special about you, so we're going to keep an eye on you. And you may be on the pathway toward becoming a shaman, because it's one of the things they would look for. That's one of the signs of someone who might have that capacity down the road. And when I heard that the first time, it really turned things on their head for me, because I had not realized, because when you grow up in a culture, you don't really know that you're being groomed toward a specific reality that is not actually reality. It's just your culture's view of different things. And I didn't really realize how much I'd internalized my culture's view of what trans identity meant, which was entirely negative. This is a terrible thing. This is horrible. Don't let anyone find out. It's not a good thing. You have to overcome that feeling in order to pursue transition at all. Yep. So to hear about a culture where this was not only not a bad thing, it was honored, that really turned things on their head for me. And I thought, well, this is just the US view of trans identity. This is not reality. This is the unfortunate way that we're raised in this country. And it
Hmm.
doesn't have to be like this.
I
So
know.
I tried really hard to help my clients see that there's a lot of advantages to understanding gender from a different perspective, from a lived experience perspective. I can
Yeah.
talk to people, for example, as a therapist, I totally understood why this was a pathway toward being a shaman. Because if you think about the job description of therapist, minister, doctor, if you combine those jobs together, you've got a fair approximation of a shaman. And for me as a therapist to sit in my office with a couple, it didn't matter what
Mhm.
gender they'd been assigned at birth. I had lived it as an adult. And that was a huge advantage working with that couple as a therapist. I didn't have to imagine if I was, for example, if I'd never transitioned, I was assigned female.
Yep.
I didn't have to imagine what it's like to be the male part of the couple, what it's
Hmm.
like to live that identity.
Right.
I mean, yeah, it plays out differently for everybody, but I have the lived experience
Hmm.
of living as a woman with estrogen as my dominant hormone, living as a man with testosterone as my dominant hormone. To
Hmm.
have both those lived experiences was a huge advantage as a therapist. So
Yep.
I helped my clients see how could this be an advantage in your life that you have this well-rounded experience of different gender roles and living different hormone balances. That's a huge advantage, but unfortunately in this culture it isn't seen like that.
I know. It's unfortunate. So how do people get a hold of you? Is this through your website to start working with
Yeah.
you? Okay.
Well, I'm not a therapist any longer, but I do trainings and I do consultation for different
Cool.
companies and businesses, and I also do a lot of consultation with other therapists. I've
Oh,
helped a number of therapists get comfortable with the idea of working with trans clients,
yeah.
people in different parts of the country, and now 10, 15 years on, they're doing great work. There's a therapist in Phoenix. There's another one in Cincinnati. I worked with both of them for quite a long time, and now they're quite comfortable working with trans and non-binary clients.
That's
But yeah, through my website, my email address is on there, my phone number's on there. Yeah, pretty easy to get a hold of me.
cool. Well, I know that the therapists need to have this training because it's very specialized and
Yeah.
they don't necessarily know what to say or do, you know.
Well, and these days, more therapy programs have classes and whatnot. Back when I became a therapist, I was one of the first people to be a trans therapist. I
Hmm.
wasn't a therapist who happened to be trans. I got into the profession to help trans people. And I don't know if I was the first, but I was one of the first to do that.
Right.
I know some other therapists who were therapists back in the 80s, but they weren't out as being
Mhm.
trans because back then, why would you do that? There's
There's
no
danger.
advantage to it. You're
Yeah.
probably going to lose your job
Yep.
because back then it was still seen as a mental illness. So
Mhm.
how can you work with the people that share your mental illness? Would have been the professional opinion back then.
Right. Wow. I mean, would you look back at all of this and say, wow, I've come a really, really long way from,
Oh yeah.
you know?
Oh yeah. And part of it's being 67, so there's an age factor, but it's aging in more than one sense. I've just finished writing my memoir, and it's in the it's in the process of being published at this point. And I just feel blessed that I thought to do this. I was given the idea, and it just kind of came into my head when I was in graduate school. I broke my leg. I was in a non-walking cast for 3 months, and I was stuck at home. I finished my master's thesis 6 months early, and I'm like, okay, Netflix didn't exist yet. What am I
Right.
going to do? Just watch TV all day, play with the cat? So I wrote the first half of my memoir, and I
Wow.
titled it Work in Progress. And I wrote the first half all the way up to the point of graduate school. And that sat on my hard drive for the next 20 years.
Oh my
And
goodness.
then during quarantine, I'm stuck at home, this time because of a pandemic. And so now I've written the second half.
Hmm.
So the voice of then and the voice of now are really different. And I feel really blessed to have approached my memoir in that way because I'm basically a different generation now than I was when I wrote the first half.
That's
And I
amazing.
mean that not just from a chronological sense, but from a transition sense.
Hmm.
Because I wrote that first half in the year 2000. I was only 3 years on hormones. That's really, really young in transition.
Wow.
Part of what it means to transition, part of what I think it means to be trans and need to take hormones to transition is that your brain all these years has been expecting one hormone and it's been getting the wrong one. So when
Mm.
you get the right hormone balance, that feeling of centeredness is, one client put it really well. She said, now I know what normal feels like. But one thing that you end up doing is you're kind of rocketed back to adolescence, and you revisit adolescence, partly because you're shifting your hormone balance, and it's just like going through puberty a second time, but you have a chance to grow up again more fully than you could the first time.
That's very
And so,
interesting.
yeah, 3 years on hormones, I was not very long into that process. Now, 25 years on hormones, I'm writing with a different voice because I'm 67, and at the same time, I'm 25.
Uh-huh.
From
Wow.
a transition perspective, I'm 25 years old.
That's very
So,
interesting.
yeah, so the voice is really different. The stories I relate are the way I look back on my childhood is really different. The way I look at my family is different.
Yep.
Yeah,
Mm.
so it's a really interesting thing to have done, and I'm glad that I did that. So now, maybe in 20 years, I'll write volume 3 of my memoir. Who knows what I'll say then? Because I could never have imagined 20 years ago the course
Wow.
my life would take.
Well, 20 years from now, you'll be 55, right? 45.
Yes, 45. From a transition perspective,
Yeah.
yes, I will.
Oh my goodness.
Yes,
So you're looking pretty good there.
really, considering I'll actually be 87.
Oh my gosh.
I know, right?
Well, that's fine. I think, well, I don't know if this is true, but supposedly people can live up to 150 now.
Oh, I don't want to live to 150. That's especially if I'm going to be this constricted with my movement. I don't really want to be this hampered for the next however many years that is. I can't even do the math.
Did you get hurt again, or what happened?
No, I had a knee replacement, and
Oh,
all these muscles are trying to recalibrate, and they're not succeeding totally well.
wow, that sounds painful. I mean,
It's uncomfortable. Let's put it that way.
well, that's cool. Um, so do you feel that because you've gone through your journey and you're telling people about your story, that in a way is empowering people, or in a way is helping people, or both?
Both, both. It is empowering. It's empowering to hear stories like that client who was of Cherokee descent,
Oh,
um, because it's not only not all bad. It can be a good thing to be trans. It's a positive thing.
yeah.
It's a benefit in relationships with other people, all kinds of relationships. I have a better understanding.
Mhm.
I certainly have a better understanding, for example, of gay men than I used to. I sing in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus, and I have since 2008. And it doesn't happen as often now, but when I first joined, guys would take me off into a corner and they would ask me questions about trans people and why someone reacted the way they did, because they didn't understand and they wanted to know more. And
Right.
I'm the kind of person, I don't call people out, I call them in.
Mm.
And it's much more powerful approach. And I get a little discouraged when I see some younger people
Hmm.
calling people out, quite frankly, and not calling them in. And I understand where it comes from, because it gets really old when people slip on pronouns, especially if you're non-binary and you're asking people to use they them pronouns for you.
Hmm.
Those are not standard pronouns used for individuals, and it takes even more adjustment for the folks in their life. Like for me, every use of the pronoun he and the word Reid, my name,
Yeah.
affirms my identity. And
Mm.
people do it automatically, calling me he.
Uh-huh.
We're not going to automatically call somebody they, them. So if you're
Right.
non-binary, you constantly and consistently have to affirm your pronouns for your whole life, and that gets really old.
Hmm.
So I understand why people end up sometimes getting so exasperated they call people out rather than call them in. Um,
When you say call people out, what does that mean?
um, to point out that they've slipped, they've messed up again, and but to put it that way and to have a tone of voice like, how could you do that again? Why are you acting?
Oh,
That is not That's not the way you should be acting. That's not the way you should be behaving. That's not the
Mm,
right language to use. And
I see.
it makes people defensive,
Mm,
and it makes them withdraw and not want to engage with that person. Uh,
yeah.
and like I said, it's really hard if you are non-binary. It's really hard not to get exasperated over time and take it personally when in fact it's a cultural issue.
Hmm.
And there's a fine line there because, as I said earlier, you can tell when people are doing something deliberately.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So if somebody's ignoring your non-binary pronoun and using they them sarcastically, for example, or something
Um,
like that, it's really easy to spot that sort of attitude and then to react from that place
mhm.
of anger because they're not respecting your identity. And how can you not be angry about that? Uh,
Hmm.
Calling people in is hard in that situation, and it's a matter of remembering these are folks who were raised in the same culture I was. It took me a while to realize I was non-binary and to act on it. Now I'm in a different place. I'm trying to bring people along with me so that we can change the culture.
Right.
It's not their fault. It's not my fault. It's a cultural fault.
Oh, I know.
It's a cultural, it's a I'm not quite sure how to put it. Our culture has an artificial view of identity because we've got this binary view that people are this or that.
Hmm.
And it's not really like that. People are much more complex than that. And I
Right.
think if we were given an opportunity, all of us, like you were saying earlier about your name, if everybody was given the opportunity and the challenge of looking at their name and taking it very seriously, does my name fit me?
Exactly.
Is this the right name for me? And then finding their own name. There's a lot of power in that. I didn't tell that story about, I told about telling my sister my name. I'm thinking of changing my name. I'd
Mhm.
already come up with the name Reid. And I'll never forget this. I was walking back from, and you probably know exactly where I'm talking about in Oakland here. I was walking back from Safeway to their house.
Uh-huh.
And on that walk, I'm casting about for a new name for myself. And the name
Right.
Reid flashed into my mind. And I thought, oh, that's it. Because the images it brought to my mind that reeds are rooted in water and they're rooted in earth at the same time. And they are flexible, they bend with the strongest winds and they don't break
Mhm.
and they survive
Yep.
through a lot of different kinds of tempests. And I thought, that's a perfect name. I love that. And I spelled it Reid just to be different. I could have spelled it Reed. I didn't really have a meaning behind that. But I think it would really be powerful if everybody understood I don't have to live with the name I was given at birth. Somebody else decided that. They decided my pronoun, they decided my gender. Who are
Mhm.
they to decide that? That's a cultural artifact that
Right.
people believe you can do that. You can
Mhm.
look at a baby and say, you're a boy, you're a girl. Not accurate.
Yep.
A lot of times they're right, but sometimes they're not.
I
And then
know.
the person who ends up having to transition gets blamed for it.
Yeah, I know.
When in fact, they were not responsible for their birth gender assignment.
It's funny. Well, I when I say funny, I don't mean like ha ha ha. I mean like sort of coincidental, kind of like I don't know. Serpent. Anyway, my Chinese name was it's very special, and that's why I wanted to keep it because my grandfather was very wealthy at the time, and he owned a lot of property in China, and he owned a lot of businesses. So when I was born, they actually took me to the monks, and I got named by the monks. So it was very special. So and then I later on found out that my name actually is usually for a boy. I'm like, oh, okay. So then the next kid that comes along is supposed to be a girl. So she would get the girl's name because the two names have to go together.
Hmm.
I didn't really understand that growing up. I just thought, oh, yeah, that's my name.
Mhm.
That's me.
Yeah,
And I'm very proud of it because it's part of my culture. So, yeah, I agree. Names are very important. And
yeah,
if we don't feel like that's the name, it's like, oh, that's not really me.
yeah.
So, Reed, I like Reed. I like Reed. So that's a good name.
Well, I've had the interesting experience over the years of having like grocery store clerks compliment me on my name, and they have no idea I chose it myself.
Oh, wow.
It just
Yeah,
makes
I
me
like
laugh
the name.
inside, like, oh, well, thank you.
So what would you say for people who are afraid? I mean, I know in this world that we live in, especially in United States, where it seems like, you know, there's a lot of talk about hate crimes, daily sometimes, depending on where we are, right? New York City, there's hate. San Francisco, there's hate. It just depends on where we are. Chicago, there's hate, right?
Mhm.
Washington, there's hate. It's like, well, what would you suggest to people who are uh, non-binary or binary? I still don't know those terms. But if they have like a gender identity question,
Mhm.
I guess they should reach out to you or someone like you or in your network.
Yeah, and just reach
Mhm.
out, because various social media platforms, Facebook, I'm very active on Facebook, so I use that as an example, but I'm sure this is true on other social media platforms
Yep.
as well, that you can find groups intended for your people.
Mm.
There's several groups on Facebook. There's one for trans men over 40 that I'm part of, and just different groups that you can join and then put it out there saying, I'm new to this, just looking for connection. You can find people that are near you.
Hmm.
Um, Bearing in mind, as I said earlier, it's not a lot to have in common to say we're both non binary or to say we're both trans men or something like that.
Hmm.
If you're going to really form a deep friendship with someone, and I do have really close friendships with some trans men, but there's other trans men that I don't really resonate with. It's like anybody
Right.
else.
Yeah.
The kids on the playground, you're going to find a couple of them that you're really close with, and
Mhm.
others you're like, I don't really want to hang out with you.
Right.
So find those folks, because sharing an identity and knowing that you're talking to someone, interacting with someone that can understand where you're coming from without a
Mhm.
lot of explanation, that may have some similar experiences, like coming out to family and having mom completely reject the idea, something like
Yep.
that. Um, or coming out to mom and having mom be really accepting. I've encountered that as well. I'm part of
Yeah.
PFLAG here in Portland. That's
That's
Parents,
cool.
Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And
Hmm.
those are the parents that I wish everybody had. There was one mom, I heard a story recently. She has a trans son,
Hmm.
and J.K. Rowling, who wrote all the Harry Potter books, has been really vilified recently for being quite transphobic
Oh,
and
really?
very public about that. And this
Mhm.
mom gathered all of their Harry Potter books, because they had all of them collected over the years. She
Yeah.
gathered them all and she took them to a used bookstore and she sold them back to the bookstore. And then she took the receipt and she sent it to the publisher and said, bye bye.
Oh my gosh.
That is a black parent response right there. That's exactly what it means to support your kids.
Mhm.
If you
Exactly.
find out one of them is LGBT in some way, shape,
Hmm.
or non-binary, or whatever the identity is, they're not straight or they're not cisgender or both. And
How do you
supporting
know?
your kid, yeah.
Hmm.
And they don't understand the parents that reject their kids, and they'll say they had
Yeah.
one job. What were they thinking?
Hmm. I don't know. What were they thinking?
They were thinking you don't match what I expected you to be. They're not
Really?
really paying attention to their own kids' experience of identity.
Mm.
And that makes it all about them and not about their kid. And that's an unfortunate
Yeah.
result. Or they're super religious in in a religion that is rejecting of this kind of identity,
Hmm.
which isn't every religion. I'm part of an Episcopal church. I'm on the vestry of my Episcopal church, and there's no one in that church who doesn't know I'm trans. If they
Hmm.
don't know I'm trans, they have not been paying attention. So
I don't think it matters to me. I don't care.
it's not every denomination that's rejecting, but the ones that are can be
Right.
really, really vicious about it.
Yeah. No, I don't. I don't care who. Somebody's boy became a girl. Girl became a boy. I don't. It's like I feel like people have their own lives to live, and they can choose to do whatever they choose to do. It's, you know. Um, that's me. I guess my non-American perspective.
Well,
So
it's a
I
matter
don't
of
know.
being true to yourself.
Yeah, I'm very true.
So the choice is in what you do about it once you realize who you are.
Hmm.
That's what I helped people as a therapist. I helped people figure out, well, what do I want to do about this? How do I approach this? Because not every one of my trans clients chose to transition immediately. Some
Yeah.
of them were in positions where they felt like, well, okay, I think I better wait a little while.
Hmm.
One, for example, had a wife who was had cancer,
Oh.
and she was dying. Sorry. And my client thought, well, I'm not going to start transition until she's died.
Hmm.
It took over a year, but
Right.
I'll tell you, as a trans woman later on down the road, she had no regrets about that. She felt completely clean in her process, but she
Mhm.
also processed it through with me to make
That's good.
sure, what is my motivation in delaying my process? Is this transphobia on my part? Am I just afraid to transition? No, I really am doing this because it's the right thing to do for my wife and for our relationship. And she felt so clean and good about the process when she finally did approach transition that she thought, yes, I did make the right decision.
Well, I'm just curious about how people can be transphobic or, experience transphobia. I'm just trying to figure that out. Like, what are they afraid of?
Change. They're
Okay.
afraid of change. And if the objection is based on religion, which it quite often is, then
Uh-huh.
they also really truly do believe that this is some form of, and they'll put it differently depending on the religion. You're
Yeah.
possessed by demons.
Mm.
You're being influenced by Satan. It's a satanic influence.
Okay.
Something is steering you away from the path of righteousness, basically.
But what is that path? You know,
Well, that's a different. You're not supposed to ask those sorts of questions.
I'm not. I
The path is
mean, not
whatever's
ask in general, like everybody.
laid out in the Bible is the path,
Oh,
and it's just,
I have no idea.
if you stray from that path, then there's something wrong. And in fact, there was one kiddo um,
Mm.
who was raised in Southern California in Orange County, which is
Ah,
extremely conservative.
yes.
And this kid
Conservative.
was put through conversion therapy twice.
Wow.
And
Hmm.
in California, it's not legal to inflict conversion therapy upon a minor. And so the church called it Bible therapy because
Oh,
they could not legally call it conversion therapy, but that is what the intention was to steer this kiddo back onto the right path.
hmm.
And this kid saved money for a couple of years and managed to get out, and now is thriving here in Portland, 18 years old, and
Wow.
not looking back.
I didn't know there was such a thing. Conversion
Conversion
therapy.
therapy? Oh my
Never,
God, yes,
never heard of it.
yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty vicious because it reinforces the idea that there's something terribly, terribly wrong with you. And
Right.
if you actually, and this is where it's so insidious, if you actually do have deeply held religious beliefs,
Hmm.
you end up believing even more that there's something deeply wrong with you. And it can lead people to suicide. And this is why it's outlawed.
Yes. Yeah.
This is
It's
exactly why it's outlawed. You can't really outlaw it if an adult is choosing to pursue this path. You can't make that illegal, but you can with a minor. But that is the fear. Every single professional organization associated with the psychology and therapy professions has taken a stance against conversion therapy because you're basically promising hope of changing a core identity that you can't change. And if you promise hope of change of something of that sort that you can't really change, you're setting people up possibly for suicide down the road or
it's just.
addiction or something of that sort because you're giving them hope and a promise, I can
Mhm.
help you change, when in fact you can't.
You mean changed back into the religion or changed back to what they're supposed to be?
Change their identity.
Okay.
The conversion has nothing to do with converting to the religion. You're converting this person who says they're trans back into normal.
Normal, like being a boy or a girl.
Yes.
Okay.
Or
But when
not
you're
being gay or
trans,
not being gay or not being lesbian. It's not
well,
limited to trans identity at all.
okay. Well, I mean, when you're trans, it's either you're a boy or a girl, right?
Yes.
Still the same. I just don't understand the. I mean, why would somebody need to say I'm trans when someone's already transitioned, like from a boy to a girl or a girl to a boy? Couldn't they just say I'm a boy?
They could.
Oh,
I don't go that route myself, and this is where you'll hear a different answer from different people you ask. Somebody else who's trans might say something completely different from me. It
Mhm.
doesn't make either one of us right or wrong. It's right for me. I'm a trans man. I'm not a man. I could
Okay.
not live 42 years of my life within, as a woman, 22 years within lesbian community, and now be just a man. My whole upbringing, my whole socialization, it was all female. And living within lesbian community for that long, being part of such a marginalized community in the 70s and 80s and on into the 90s, there's no way I would ever be able to see myself as just a man.
Well, not just, but just,
So,
you
so I,
know.
so I identify as a trans man, not as a man, and that's why. But you'll hear different things from different people,
Okay.
and we don't all say the same thing. And that's an important thing to remember, because you might hear somebody else say something completely different. Oh yeah, I'm a man now. Left that
Yeah.
completely behind. And then you might be thinking, well, Reid said something completely different. I'm just not getting it. I don't
I don't
understand
get
what
it at
you're
all.
speaking. But it's not you. It's not
I
you. We are saying really different things.
Okay. All right. I mean, if we need to identify ourselves as one gender or another, I mean, it's just a checkbox, right? Like boy, girl, male,
Well, if I'm
female.
faced with a checkbox on a form, like
Yeah.
check male, check female, of course I'm going to check male. But I
Mhm.
always laugh when I do that, because I think, this is the binary playing out again. Here we go again. I
I
don't
know.
take
It's
it very
funny.
seriously. But I
Yeah.
do it because I know that I'm going to confuse a computer somewhere. If I don't check a box at all, somebody's
Exactly.
going to call me and say, you didn't check this box and we can't process your application until you do. Okay, fine,
Okay.
check mail.
What about just NA, like not applicable? Don't ask.
That's not usually the options are just male, female.
I
Now,
know.
these days, and this is another thing I help agencies and organizations do, is figure out, okay, if I need to know if somebody wants transitioned, like if it's a medical system form, it's
Mhm.
kind of important that they understand
Yes.
that my body is not what you would think a cisgender man's body would look like. It's important information for them.
Right.
So what some organizations or hospitals might do is say, okay, on an intake form, it might say male, female, and it might say something like, is this the gender that was assigned to you at birth? And then you
Okay.
could check yes or no. And
Yep.
then they know that they're dealing with someone who's transitioned at some point physically, possibly. And then
Right.
they have a whole other series of questions they might ask that will
Mm.
give them more appropriate medical information.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if male, female are the only options, and I check that, then somewhere along the line, some doctor is going to have to backtrack and capture the information they could have gotten at the beginning.
Right. Well, medically speaking, yes, that's important.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
socially speaking, would you just say, "Hi, I'm a trans man," or "I'm a trans woman"? I mean,
Well, you don't introduce yourself as a woman, but if it comes up, which it actually comes up more often than you might think, I would certainly tell people that I once transitioned, in part because that's part of my goal of calling people in, because I
um,
do have a lot of information. I do know a lot about this topic and about the identities in question, and I
right.
want to be there for people. And I can only be there for people and answer questions and have conversations with them about family members or friends that they have that are transitioning or whatever. I can only do that if they know that I am that kind of resource for them. But
Right.
that's part of my calling in life. I'm a bridge builder. I build bridges between people, and that's what I do. And I can only do that if people know that I can do that and like to do that. I enjoy doing that. That's part of my mission in life.
That's important. You know, I'm still trying to find out what is my mission in life.
Well, I feel blessed to have discovered it 20 something years ago. But I
Well,
also realize if I hadn't had the life I had, if I hadn't lived that long within lesbian community, for example,
yep.
I wouldn't I wouldn't have that bridge that I can build,
I
because I
know.
can talk to lesbians of a certain age, my age, and I can talk to them because I was one of them.
Hmm. And
And
that's important. You know.
and that's part of the coming out process too, because otherwise they're just going to see me as another guy. And why would I know anything about lesbian community? So
That's true.
it gives me credibility
It does. Yeah. And
and lists this many identities.
that's important for people who are going through the journey. You know, I'm
Mhm.
calling it a journey. I don't even know if that's the
It is a
correct term.
journey. Yeah,
Okay. All right.
it's just one
Uh,
of many journeys through life.
right. So the hormones, you mentioned hormones. Is that like a lifelong like medication to take?
It can be. This
Yeah.
is one of the blessings of transition is that we have control over our hormone balance.
Mhm.
So we're not stuck with whatever our bodies are producing. We
Okay.
can alter the balance based on how we feel, um, based on what feels right to us. So
Mhm.
yes and no. Um, you don't have to take hormones lifelong. And this gets really interesting because estrogen, when you block testosterone and take estrogen as an adult,
Mhm.
testosterone's already influenced your voice. You already have some kind of deep voice. You've already got some level of facial hair and body hair. And it takes work to undo the body hair and facial hair. And it takes work with some kind of trainer to help
Right.
you alter your voice. But I used to tell my clients if Dustin Hoffman could do it in Tootsie, if Robin Williams could do it in Mrs. Doubtfire, you can do it too. It just takes work. And also, I would tell them B. Arthur probably got called sir on the phone a lot.
Probably.
Yeah. So there are cisgender women with really deep voices.
Oh, I know.
I would help, but I would help them remember that because that was one of the big sticking points for my trans women
Mhm.
clients was their voice.
Yeah.
But for trans men, testosterone does all those things that it did for the trans women that they didn't want. The deep
Mhm.
voice, the facial hair. Once your voice changes as a trans man, you're not going to get called ma'am probably ever again because your voice is out of the range. You're going to be like B. Arthur, get called sir on the phone all the time, which is what you want if you're a trans man.
I know, right?
Yeah. But the hormones, it's really interesting because having been part of lesbian community, it
Hmm.
took me a while,
Yep.
a good long while, to really admit that there are hormonal implications, hormonal reasons for all those cultural stereotypes about women being more emotional than men, for example, or
I
men
know.
only ever thinking about sex. Those are stereotypes that are really denigrated within lesbian community and feminist community in general because they're used to put women down.
Yep.
But there really is hormonal basis in those stereotypes because anyone who's ever taken hormones to transition will tell you there's some truth in it. I had
Hmm.
trans women clients who would start taking estrogen, and one of them came in my office one day and she was just in despair. She said she was a project manager, and
Hmm.
she said that for the first time since she started taking hormones, there was some kind of really tense kind of thing that happened at work. And she said ordinarily, when she'd been testosterone based, it would have been fine. She would have just sat the people down and said, okay, let's talk it out. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Let's do it and just do it.
Uh-huh.
She said with estrogen as her dominant hormone, she felt this sudden upwelling of emotion in her heart. And she was like, oh my God. And she excused herself and ran off to the bathroom really quick.
Oh my gosh.
And the door was closing and she looked in the mirror and she was crying. She burst into tears and she said, how can I do my job? How do women handle this?
Yep.
And of course, she's talking to me about this at our next therapy session. And I said, well, women had all of puberty to get used to this hormone balance and figure out how to navigate the world with this as their dominant hormone. They don't know any different. And you learn how to do it.
Right.
But here she is 40 something years old and she's
Mm.
never had to do it before. So all of a sudden in the workplace, she's going through puberty, basically.
So she's a teenager.
She's a teenager. Yeah.
Just that you're in your what, 20s?
Getting used to this hormone balance and
Yep.
never having experienced it before. And on the flip side, I had trans men come into my office and say, oh my God, I can't think about anything except sex. How do guys get anything done?
Oh my goodness.
Again, if you're acting like a 14-year-old boy, that's exactly the experience
Wow.
of the 14-year-old boy. But
That's
the
very
problem is, if
interesting.
you're holding down a job and you're 40 something years old,
Yep.
people don't expect you to be a teenager. They
Yeah.
don't understand that this is what you're going through.
Uh-oh. So that's really important, the type of trainings that you're doing with organizations.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't know, like, oh, people going through transition, they're pretty much starting at childhood, right? With the hormones.
Well,
I
they're
would,
starting adolescence. They're
oh, I wouldn't
revisiting
know.
adolescence with a different hormone balance. But
That's
that's
very
that's
interesting.
that's the point where people who are cisgender can have a glimpse of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
because everybody goes through that. When you're 9 years old, you have a really different experience of the world than when you're 13 or 14.
Yep.
And those hormones have kicked in, and it changes everything. And the way you look at the world and other people and yourself is really different from then on. And this is a similar thing. The problem is the further into adulthood you are when you undergo this, the harder it is for your peers to understand,
Oh, I'm
because
sure.
they left adolescence behind a long time ago.
And life too, life lessons, right? All the
Hmm.
stuff that they would have gone through for 20 years or however long it has been.
Hmm.
Wow. I learned a lot today, Reid. Thank you so much for sharing.
Well, you're
And I'm hoping
entirely
that
welcome.
everyone who's tuned in will find this very important and valuable, especially for people who have family members transitioning
Yeah.
and maybe they have some gender questions, and don't know how to talk or find anybody to talk to.
Well,
I think
and
you give out very valuable
one other
resources.
thing that I did
Hmm.
was, as you know, my mom died in 2004,
Yep.
and my oldest sister died in 2004.
Hmm.
And in fact, yesterday was the anniversary of my mom's death.
I know.
And
She was the pillar of the family.
she sure was. And
Yeah.
when my oldest sister died, I was really galvanized because I thought, okay, Jan was only 62.
Yeah.
And I really better get off the shit here and write some of this down, because by that
Yeah.
time I'd worked with several hundred clients, and I thought, okay, I've got to write this down. So I wrote my first book, Transition and Beyond. And I
Hmm.
basically wrote the book that I wished had been available to my mother, my
Hmm.
best friend from the lesbian community, my therapist for certain, and sure and certain. I wrote the book I wished had been available to me to give to other people when I transitioned. Family members, it's got a chapter in it for partners. I talk about religion, I talk about transition in the workplace, and I present this developmental model of transition as a journey and not as something to diagnose. The identity emergence model that I was talking about earlier. Um, and that book has been really powerful. It's been used as a textbook in a number of counseling programs, teaching classes about working with trans clients. And it's just, but I didn't write it just for therapists. It's not written in that kind of language. It's written in language anyone can understand. It's not what you would call textbook language. It's people language. Um, but that book I do recommend for people who are experiencing transition, whether it's through the coworker, a family member, whatever. With coworkers in particular, you're supposed to not bring your personal issues into the workplace, right? You're supposed to check that at the door. But if you've got
Supposed
a
to.
coworker, yeah, supposed to, exactly. If you've got the coworker in the next cubicle over who's transitioning and they want a new name and a new pronoun and they're starting to use the other bathroom, it raises up issues for people
Oh, yes.
because it challenges a lot of their beliefs about what the appropriate boundaries are culturally.
Hmm.
But they don't know where to take that in the workplace. So I've done trainings in the workplace because that's where they can take it. They can ask me questions, and quite often the person who's in transition doesn't even come to those trainings because I'm the one answering the questions. Then they're not in the spotlight so much,
Right.
but it helps their coworkers adjust. So things like that. Partner adjustment, we didn't even talk about that, but that's huge.
Yeah.
What do you do if you've been married to what person you thought of as a guy for 25 years and suddenly they tell you I feel like a woman inside? That challenges the wife's sense of identity.
Of course.
I had one wife tell me, I thought I married a sensitive man. Now you're telling me you're a woman.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but it takes a
Hmm.
pretty dedicated partner to
Yes.
stay in the relationship because they will be dealing with their own family's reactions. Well,
Oh,
of
I know.
course you're going to leave. Well, no, actually, I'm going to stay. And then they have to deal with their family questioning, why would you do that? What about your kids? That sort of
Because
thing.
they want to, people live their lives the way they want to live, and right? Who are we to judge,
Well,
right?
a lot of people think that they have the right to do just that.
Yeah, I don't judge. I'm like, okay, that's just another person. you know, I don't know. I guess everyone should. Well, I wouldn't say should. It's just whatever they feel is right. how they might feel that how they're being treated later on. If they were in the same situation, how would they want to be treated?
Hmm.
Right? In my master's studies, we talked about the golden rule, and then we also came up with something called the platinum rule. Golden rule is treat others like what is it? Treat others as you would want to be treated,
Hmm.
and then the other one is treat others as you would like to be treated. Like you treat others. Well, anyway, essentially, it's the same thing.
And I always tell people treat others the way that they would like to be treated.
Yes, that too is very important. All right, so I guess we better start getting on and doing other things with our day today.
Okay.
I would love to keep talking with you. It's been such
Oh
a
yeah,
joy.
I can talk for hours, as you can tell.
Me too. I guess I'm not shy.
Me either.
Well, yeah, that's good. So people who need to get a hold of you or just have questions, reach out to Reid Vanderburgh. Reid is in Oregon. He's been there. You've been there for how long now? Since 1990?
1976.
Oh, wow.
So 2/3 of my life. I was not even quite 21 when I moved here.
Yeah, I was very young at that time.
Yeah.
I didn't really know you back then.
I would say not. Eric was
Not yet.
back then.
Yeah, I know he was 5, I guess, at the time. Yeah. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. I hope people will reach out to Reid Vanderburgh. Reid is he's genuine in everything that he does. Very good person.
Well, thank
And
you, Susan.
I'm very glad you were able. Thank you, and I'm glad that you were able to join us today and share your journey, and hopefully more people will understand. We can't hope that everyone will understand, but we will try to give as much information as possible to people so they're not afraid of change or whatever it is
Yes.
now in life. And change can be hard for a lot of people, even the person or people going through the change.
Mhm.
So thank you, Reid. Thank you so much.
Sorry, now I'm coughing.
Aw. Yeah, the winds have been really crazy. Well, anyway, thank you all for tuning in to Talk to Susan. This is the show where we have real talks with real people, real issues, and people who are making a difference and have not really been recognized. So thank you all for tuning in. This is Susan Vanderburgh signing off. Thank you, Reid.
Thank you.
Everyone. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.